The battlefield stretched out in a desolate expanse, shrouded in the hazy light of a dying day. Smoke from smoldering wreckage drifted across the war-torn landscape, masking the stench of blood and ass. Sergeant Lyra Draven moved swiftly, her rifle clutched tightly in her hands, her sharp eyes scanning the ruins of the enemy camp. Her squad followed in practiced silence, their nerves taut as bowstrings. This was supposed to be a simple reconnaissance mission, a quick in and out to gather intelligence. But war never played by the rules. Lyra's pulse quickened as they approached the heart of the enemy stronghold. The camp was eerily quiet, its usual chaos replaced by an unsettling calm. She motioned for her squad to fan out, their boots crunching softly against the dirt. The faint rustle of canvas and the creak of makeshift barricades were the only sounds that accompanied them. Her attention was drawn to a collapsed structure at the edge of the camp. The faintest groan carried on the wind, barely audible, but enough to catch her ear. She raised a hand, signaling for her team to halt, and crept toward the source of the sound. Her instinct screamed caution, but curiosity propelled her forward. As she pushed aside the tattered remnants of a tent, her breath caught in her throat. Shackled to a heavy iron post was a beast man, his massive frame slumped against the dirt. His fur, a dark shade mottled with streaks of silver, was matted with blood and grime. Chains bound his wrists and ankles, cutting into his flesh. His head hung low, but even in his weakened state, there was an undeniable power in his presence. The beast man stirred, lifting his head to meet her gaze. His eyes, a piercing shade of gold, locked onto hers with a mixture of defiance and desperation. For a moment, neither of them moved, the world narrowing to the space between them. "Human," he rasped, his voice deep and raw. "You should kill me. It's what your kind does best." Lyra hesitated, her heart pounding. This was no ordinary prisoner of war. His presence here was a puzzle, a piece of the enemy's strategy she couldn't ignore. Yet, as she stared into his eyes, she saw more than just an enemy. There was pain there, and something deeper, something she couldn't quite name. "Sergeant, we need to move," one of her squad mates hissed from behind her. The enemy could return any moment. Lyra ignored the warning, her focus still on the beast man. "Why are you here? Why did they leave you like this?" she demanded. The beast man gave a bitter laugh, a sound that sent a shiver down her spine. "I am of no use to them anymore. My strength failed, and so they discarded me, just as your people would." Lyra clenched her jaw. Every instinct told her to walk away, to leave him to his fate and complete the mission. But something in her rebelled against that idea. She couldn't explain it, but abandoning him felt wrong. Against all logic, she made her decision. "Get the chains off him," she ordered. Her squad erupted in whispers of protest. "Sergeant, are you insane? He's one of them. He won't survive long enough to be a threat," Lyra shot back. "We're taking him. Move." Reluctantly, her team set to work. The chains were thick and rusted, but with some effort, they managed to break them. The beast man collapsed forward, and Lyra caught him, his weight almost staggering her. His body was warm and solid, the muscles beneath his fur tense with restrained power. For a brief moment, she felt the rhythmic thud of his heartbeat against her own. He looked at her, his golden eyes filled with something she couldn't quite place. Gratitude? Caution? It unsettled her in ways she wasn't ready to confront. "You have a death wish, human," he murmured, his voice softer now. "But I won't forget this." "Save your strength," she replied, her tone brisk. "You're going to need it." The squad moved quickly, their movements efficient despite their unease. The beast man, though weak, pushed himself to walk with Lyra's support. Each step was a silent challenge, a defiance of the death that had nearly claimed him. They had just reached the edge of the camp when a distant shout echoed behind them. The enemy was returning. "Move," Lyra barked, adrenaline surging through her veins. They plunged into the forest, the fading light providing just enough cover. The beast man stumbled but kept pace, his breathing labored. Lyra's squad kept their weapons at the ready, their nerves stretched thin as they navigated the dense underbrush. When they finally reached a hidden ravine, Lyra signaled for a stop. They were far enough from the camp to catch their breath, but not safe yet. The beast man sank to the ground, his broad chest heaving as he leaned against a tree. Lyra knelt beside him, pulling a canteen from her pack. "Drink," she said, offering it to him. He hesitated, then took it, his claws brushing her hand. His lips barely touched the rim before he pulled back, his eyes flickering with something akin to hesitation. "I'm not poisoned," she said dryly. "If I wanted you dead, you'd be dead." The corner of his mouth lifted in a wry smile. "Fair point." He drank deeply, his throat working as he swallowed. Lyra watched him, unable to ignore the strange pull she felt in his presence. He was a creature of war, a symbol of everything she was supposed to hate. Yet, here he was, injured, vulnerable, and completely at her mercy. And here she was, defying orders to save him. "What's your name?" she asked after a moment. He looked at her, his gaze steady. "Rhaegar." She nodded. "Lyra. Try not to slow us down, Rhaegar." His smile widened, revealing sharp canines. "I wouldn't dream of it, Lyra." The sound of distant footsteps snapped her back to the present. The enemy was closer than she'd thought. "Let's move," she ordered, helping Rhaegar to his feet. The forest stretched ahead, dark and foreboding, but it was their only hope. As they pushed forward, Lyra couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. Night fell as Lyra and her squad pressed deeper into the forest, the canopy above swallowing what little light the moon offered. The distant sounds of enemy patrols echoed faintly, but for now, they seemed to have outrun immediate danger. Lyra pushed forward, her senses sharp, every step calculated. The beast man, Rhaegar, moved beside her, his presence a constant reminder of the risk she'd taken. They stopped in a small clearing surrounded by dense foliage. Lyra raised her hand, signaling for the squad to rest. The soldiers dropped to the ground, exhaustion etched into their faces, but their eyes darted nervously toward Rhaegar. He stood apart, leaning heavily against a tree, his breathing still labored. His wounds hadn't stopped bleeding entirely, and his strength was clearly waning. "We'll hold here for the night," Lyra said, her voice firm but low. "Rotate watches. I'll take first." Her squad exchanged wary glances, but didn't argue. They trusted her, even if they didn't trust the beast man. Once the others settled, Lyra approached Rhaegar. His golden eyes flicked up to meet hers as she knelt in front of him. Up close, she could see the weariness in his face, the way his body trembled slightly as he fought to remain upright. "You're still bleeding," she said, pulling a small medkit from her pack. "Let me see." Rhaegar's lips curled in a faint smirk, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "I thought humans only tended to their own." "Consider yourself lucky then," she replied, her tone dry. "Now sit." He grunted but complied, lowering himself onto the forest floor. Lyra knelt beside him, her hands working quickly to clean and bandage the gashes along his side. His fur was coarse beneath her fingers, warm despite the cool night air. She tried to focus on the task, but the quiet between them was heavy, charged with unspoken tension. "You risked a lot back there," Rhaegar said after a long silence. "For me." Lyra glanced up, her eyes meeting his. "I couldn't just leave you there." "You could have," he countered, his voice low and rough. "And no one would have blamed you." She didn't have an answer for that, not one she was ready to voice. Instead, she finished wrapping his wounds and leaned back, her hands resting on her thighs. "I'm not like them," she said finally. "I don't see the point in more death if it doesn't serve a purpose." Rhaegar studied her, his gaze intense. "And what purpose do you see in saving me?" Lyra held his gaze, her heart thudding in her chest. "Maybe I just don't want to see another life wasted." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The sounds of the forest filled the silence, the rustle of leaves, the distant call of an owl. Lyra was acutely aware of how close they were, of the warmth radiating from his massive form. His eyes softened slightly, and for the first time, he looked at her not as a soldier, but as something more. "Thank you," he said quietly. The words were simple, but they carried a weight that lingered in the air between them. Lyra nodded, her throat tightening unexpectedly. She rose to her feet, trying to shake the strange pull she felt toward him. "Get some rest," she said, her voice steadier now. "You'll need your strength." Rhaegar inclined his head, watching her as she moved to take her place on watch. His eyes lingered on her until she disappeared into the shadows. The night passed uneventfully, though Lyra found sleep difficult to come by. When morning broke, the squad packed up and prepared to move again. Rhaegar seemed stronger after the brief rest, though his movements were still deliberate, his energy conserved. He walked beside Lyra as they continued through the dense forest, his presence both a comfort and a distraction. As the hours passed, they spoke little, the silence between them comfortable but weighted. It wasn't until they reached a narrow stream that Rhaegar finally broke the quiet. "We're not so different, you and I," he said, his voice thoughtful. Lyra glanced at him, raising an eyebrow. "Is that so?" He nodded, crouching beside the water to drink. "We're both warriors, bound by duty. But you don't fight just because you're told to. You question. You think." Lyra crossed her arms, leaning against a tree as she watched him. "And what about you? Do you fight because you want to or because you have to?" Rhaegar paused, the water dripping from his hands. "Once I fought for my people," he said, his tone quiet. "To protect them, to prove my strength. But now, I'm not sure what I fight for." His honesty caught her off guard. She hadn't expected vulnerability from him. Not like this. It made her chest tighten, the barriers she'd carefully constructed beginning to crack. "Maybe that's something we both need to figure out," she said softly. Rhaegar looked up at her, his eyes searching hers. For a moment, the world seemed to narrow, the space between them charged with unspoken understanding. Then he rose, his towering form casting a shadow over her. "We should keep moving," he said, his voice steady once more. Lyra nodded, pushing off the tree. Together, they rejoined the squad and continued their journey. By late afternoon, the forest began to thin, giving way to rocky terrain. They found shelter in a shallow cave, its entrance hidden by a tangle of vines. The squad set up a small camp, their movements quiet and efficient. As night fell again, Lyra found herself sitting beside Rhaegar near the cave's entrance. The others kept their distance, their unease with the beast man still evident. Lyra, however, felt drawn to him, her instincts telling her that he was more than just an ally in this war. "You're quiet tonight," she said, breaking the silence. Rhaegar glanced at her, a hint of amusement in his eyes. "I didn't think humans cared much for conversation with my kind." Lyra smirked. "Maybe I'm not like most humans." He chuckled, a low, rumbling sound that sent a strange warmth through her. "No, you're not." They sat in silence for a while, the night stretching on around them. The air between them was heavy with unspoken words, the tension growing with each passing moment. Finally, Rhaegar shifted, his golden eyes locking onto hers. "Lyra," he said, his voice low and serious. "You've risked everything for me. I won't forget that." She swallowed, her heart thudding in her chest. "I'm not looking for gratitude, Rhaegar." His gaze softened, and he leaned in slightly, his massive form close enough that she could feel his warmth. "Then what are you looking for?" Lyra hesitated, her breath catching. She didn't have an answer, at least not one she could put into words. All she knew was that in this moment, with the weight of the war pressing down on them, she didn't feel alone. And for now, that was enough. The morning light filtered through the tangled vines at the mouth of the cave, casting dappled patterns on the stone walls. Lyra stirred from her restless sleep, her body stiff from the uneven ground. The weight of the past few days settled heavily on her shoulders as she sat up and surveyed the camp. Her squad moved quietly, gathering their supplies and preparing for another day of travel. Her gaze shifted to Rhaegar, who sat cross-legged near the cave entrance, his eyes closed as if lost in thought. Despite his injuries, his powerful form radiated an air of unyielding strength. He seemed almost at peace, though Lyra knew better. Beneath the calm exterior, he was a warrior, always on guard. She approached him, her footsteps light on the rocky ground. His ears twitched slightly, signaling he was aware of her presence even before she spoke. "You seem better," she said, crossing her arms as she leaned against the cave wall. Rhaegar opened his eyes, their golden hue catching the morning light. "The rest helped," he replied, his deep voice rumbling softly. "Though I doubt we'll have the luxury of peace for long." Lyra nodded, her lips pressing into a thin line. She knew he was right. The enemy wouldn't stop searching for them, and their window of safety was rapidly closing. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that there was something else weighing on him. "You've been quiet since yesterday," she said, her tone softer now. "What's on your mind?" Rhaegar's gaze held hers for a moment before he looked away, his jaw tightening. "I'm thinking about the path ahead," he said. "About what happens when we reach your lines." Lyra frowned, her brows knitting together. "You think they won't accept you?" "I know they won't," he said bluntly. "Your people see my kind as monsters. Even if they don't kill me on sight, I'll never be more than a prisoner to them." Lyra felt a pang of guilt at his words. She knew he was right. The distrust between their species ran deep, and bringing him into human territory would be risky at best. But the thought of leaving him behind was unthinkable. "We'll find a way," she said firmly. "I won't let them hurt you." Rhaegar studied her, his expression unreadable. "You're willing to fight your own people for me?" "If that's what it takes," she said without hesitation. His eyes softened, and for a moment, the distance between them seemed to vanish. "You're a stubborn woman, Lyra Draven. And you're a stubborn beast," she shot back, a faint smile tugging at her lips. Rhaegar chuckled, the sound low and warm. "Perhaps that's why we've survived this long." They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of their shared understanding settling between them. Then Lyra straightened, her resolve hardening. "Come on," she said. "We need to move." The group made steady progress through the rugged terrain, the forest gradually giving way to rolling hills. The air grew colder as they climbed higher, and the tension among the squad was palpable. They were heading toward a narrow pass that would lead them to the outskirts of human territory, a dangerous route, but the fastest. As they approached the pass, Lyra's instincts prickled. She raised a hand, signaling for the squad to halt. The wind carried the faintest sound of movement, and her sharp eyes scanned the rocky landscape. "We're not alone," she murmured. Rhaegar stepped up beside her, his keen senses already on high alert. His nostrils flared as he inhaled deeply, and his ears swiveled toward the source of the sound. "Patrol," he said, his voice low. "2, maybe 3. Lyra nodded, her mind racing. They couldn't afford a confrontation, not this close to safety. She quickly motioned for the squad to take cover among the rocks, her heart pounding as they waited in tense silence. The sound of footsteps grew louder, accompanied by the muffled voices of enemy soldiers. Lyra gripped her rifle tightly, her muscles coiled like a spring. Beside her, Rhaegar crouched low, his claws flexing as he prepared for a fight. The soldiers appeared over the ridge, their dark uniforms stark against the rocky backdrop. There were 3 of them, heavily armed and alert. Lyra held her breath, willing them to pass by without noticing the hidden group. But luck wasn't on their side. One of the soldiers paused, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the area. His hand moved to his weapon, and Lyra knew they'd been spotted. "Move," she barked, breaking cover and opening fire. The clearing erupted into chaos as gunfire rang out, the sharp cracks echoing off the rocks. Lyra's squad moved with practiced precision, returning fire as they repositioned. Rhaegar launched himself into the fray, his massive form a blur of motion as he closed the distance between them and the enemy. The first soldier barely had time to react before Rhaegar struck, his claws slicing through armor with terrifying ease. The second soldier turned his weapon on Rhaegar, but Lyra's shot found its mark, dropping him before he could fire. The last soldier attempted to retreat, but Rhaegar was faster. He tackled the man to the ground, pinning him with one massive hand. The soldier's eyes widened in terror as Rhaegar's fangs bared in a snarl. "Rhaegar, stop." Lyra called out, her voice cutting through the din. Rhaegar hesitated, his breath coming in heavy pants. Slowly, he released the soldier, who scrambled to his feet and fled, disappearing over the ridge. Lyra approached cautiously, her rifle still at the ready. "Are you all right?" Rhaegar straightened, his chest heaving. "I'm fine," he said, though his voice was edged with frustration. "But we've lost the element of surprise." Lyra nodded grimly. The gunfire would have drawn attention, and more patrols would be on their way. They needed to move quickly. "We're close to the border," she said. "We'll make a break for it." The squad regrouped, their pace quickening as they pushed through the pass. The air grew thinner, the wind biting against their skin. But they didn't stop. Lyra's determination burned like a beacon, driving them forward. As they crested the final ridge, the sight of familiar territory stretched out before them. Relief washed over Lyra, but it was short-lived. The sound of distant shouts and the unmistakable clatter of boots on rock signaled that the enemy was still on their trail. "We're not out of this yet," she muttered. Rhaegar glanced at her, his eyes fierce. "Then let's finish it." Together, they prepared for the final push, knowing that their survival and their fragile alliance depended on what happened next. The border outpost loomed ahead, a line of fortifications marking the edge of human territory. The sight should have brought relief, but Lyra's heart only tightened with dread. She knew what awaited them: protocol, suspicion, and a long road of convincing the higher-ups that Rhaegar wasn't a threat. Her squad trudged behind her, their silence heavy with exhaustion and tension. Rhaegar, as always, stayed close, his golden eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of danger. As they drew closer, Lyra raised her hand, signaling for the squad to halt. "We'll rest here for a moment," she said. "We need a plan before we approach." The soldiers dropped their packs, grateful for even a brief reprieve. Rhaegar leaned against a boulder, his towering frame blending into the rugged terrain. His gaze met Lyra's, and she saw the flicker of uncertainty there. For all his strength, she knew he wasn't blind to the danger that lay ahead. "What do you expect when we reach your outpost?" Rhaegar asked quietly, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "They'll question us, maybe even detain us," Lyra admitted. "But I'll make them listen. They'll have to, once I explain everything." Rhaegar's mouth twitched in a grim approximation of a smile. "You have more faith in your leaders than I would." "It's not faith," she said, her tone firm. "It's necessity. They need to understand that this war won't end if we keep treating each other like monsters." He nodded, though his expression remained skeptical. Lyra could hardly blame him. The scars of conflict ran deep, and trust was a fragile, elusive thing. She stepped closer, lowering her voice even further. "I won't let them hurt you," she said, her eyes locked on his. "You have my word." Rhaegar's gaze softened, a warmth flickering in his eyes that made her pulse quicken. "I believe you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "And that's enough." For a moment, they stood there, the world around them fading into the background. Lyra was acutely aware of the space between them, the charged silence that seemed to hum with unspoken emotion. Without thinking, she reached out, her fingers brushing against his arm. His skin was warm beneath her touch, the coarse fur surprisingly soft. Rhaegar didn't pull away. Instead, he lifted his hand, his claws lightly tracing the edge of her glove. The gesture was hesitant, almost reverent, as if he was afraid to break the fragile connection between them. "You're not like the others," he said softly, his golden eyes searching hers. "And you're not the monster they told us about," she replied, her voice equally quiet. The moment stretched, the tension between them deepening with each passing second. Lyra's heart thudded in her chest, and she couldn't tell if it was fear or something far more dangerous. Rhaegar's gaze dropped briefly to her lips, and a flicker of heat sparked in her core. But before either of them could act, one of her soldiers called out, "Sergeant, we've got movement near the ridge." Lyra snapped back to reality, her hand falling away as she turned toward the warning. Her squad was already on alert, weapons drawn and eyes scanning the distant terrain. She moved quickly, her rifle at the ready as she joined them. Through her scope, she saw what had caught their attention: another patrol, smaller than the last, but no less dangerous. The enemy soldiers moved cautiously, their weapons at the ready, clearly searching for something. Or someone. They must have tracked us from the pass, Lyra muttered. We don't have time to wait. She turned to her squad. We make for the outpost now. Stick to the rocks, keep low, and stay together. Her soldiers nodded, their faces set with grim determination. Lyra glanced at Rhaegar, who had already stepped forward, his posture tense and ready for a fight. Let's move, she said, and together they began their descent toward the border. The terrain was rough, the rocky ground uneven beneath their boots. The patrol hadn't spotted them yet, but Lyra knew it was only a matter of time. They moved quickly but carefully, every sound and movement calculated to avoid detection. As they neared the outpost, the tension in Lyra's chest grew unbearable. The enemy patrol was closing in, and the border guards wouldn't take kindly to their sudden approach. She had to hope that her authority and their desperate situation would buy them enough time to explain. They reached the final stretch, a narrow path that led directly to the outpost's gates. Lyra raised her hand, signaling for the squad to stop. We're going to have to run for it, she said. Rhaegar, stay close to me. Don't make any sudden moves, no matter what happens. He nodded, his expression unreadable. Understood. Taking a deep breath, Lyra gave the signal, and they broke into a sprint. The enemy patrol shouted behind them, their voices sharp and urgent. Gunfire cracked through the air, the bullets striking the rocks around them. Lyra's heart pounded as they raced toward the gates, the fortified walls looming ever closer. Hold your fire, she shouted as they neared the outpost. Friendly forces incoming. The border guards reacted quickly, their weapons trained on the approaching group. Lyra skidded to a stop just outside the gates, raising her hands in a show of peace. Behind her, Rhaegar slowed, his massive form drawing immediate attention. Stand down, Lyra barked, her voice carrying the authority of her rank. This man is under my protection. The guards hesitated, their eyes flicking between Lyra and Rhaegar. Tension crackled in the air, the soldiers clearly torn between their orders and the unexpected sight before them. One of the guards stepped forward, his weapon still raised. Sergeant Draven, explain yourself, he demanded. Why is there a beast man with you? There's no time, Lyra said, her voice sharp. Enemy patrol closing in. Let us through, and I'll explain everything. The guard hesitated for a heartbeat longer before nodding. Open the gates. The heavy doors creaked open, and Lyra ushered her squad inside. Rhaegar followed closely, his every movement drawing wary glances from the border guards. As the gates closed behind them, the sound of gunfire faded, leaving only the tense silence of the outpost. Lyra turned to face the gathered soldiers, her jaw set. We've got a lot to discuss, she said. But first, we need to secure the perimeter. The guards exchanged uncertain looks, but eventually nodded, moving to reinforce the gates. Lyra felt Rhaegar's presence beside her, his quiet strength a steadying force amidst the chaos. They were safe for now, but the real battle was just beginning. The outpost's central hall was dimly lit, the heavy stone walls amplifying the tension in the air. Lyra stood at the head of the room, her squad flanking her while Rhaegar lingered behind, his presence as imposing as ever. The outpost's commander, a grizzled veteran named Captain Renard, paced before her, his expression a mix of disbelief and barely restrained anger. You brought a beast man into our territory, Sergeant, Renard said, his voice low but laced with steel. Do you have any idea what kind of risk you've taken? What you've put us all in? Lyra stood her ground, her chin raised defiantly. With all due respect, sir, Rhaegar isn't a threat. He saved my life and the lives of my squad. If it weren't for him, we wouldn't be here. Renard's eyes flicked to Rhaegar, who met his gaze without flinching. The beastman's golden eyes seemed to burn with quiet intensity, a silent challenge to the scrutiny he faced. Renard turned back to Lyra, his frown deepening. You expect me to believe that this creature, he said, gesturing toward Rhaegar, isn't just biding his time, waiting for the perfect moment to betray us. If he wanted to kill us, he had plenty of chances, Lyra shot back. Instead, he fought alongside us. He bled for us. That has to mean something. Renard's lips pressed into a thin line, but before he could respond, another soldier entered the room, carrying the battered scroll case. The soldier handed it to Renard, who opened it and scanned the contents. His eyes narrowed as he read, and when he looked up, his expression was grave. This was intercepted from the enemy patrol, Renard said, holding up the parchment. It's a map, and it leads to something in the ruins near here, something they're desperate to find. Rhaegar stepped forward, his movements slow and deliberate. Let me see it, he said, his deep voice filling the room. Renard hesitated, but Lyra nodded in silent encouragement. With a grunt, the captain handed the map to Rhaegar, who studied it closely. His brow furrowed as he traced the lines with one clawed finger. This marks an ancient site, Rhaegar said, his tone thoughtful. My people once guarded it long ago. If the enemy seeks it now, they may have found a way to exploit its power. What kind of power are we talking about? Lyra asked. Rhaegar's gaze met hers, and for a moment, his eyes darkened with unease. A power that could turn the tide of this war, he said quietly. If they unlock it, neither of our peoples will stand a chance. The weight of his words settled over the room, and even Renard seemed momentarily shaken. Lyra clenched her fists, her mind racing. They couldn't afford to ignore this threat, not if the stakes were as high as Rhaegar implied. We need to get to those ruins before they do, Lyra said, her voice steady. If there's any chance we can stop them, we have to take it. Renard studied her for a long moment before nodding reluctantly. Agreed. But you're taking a small team. We can't risk leaving the outpost undefended. Lyra turned to her squad, her eyes scanning their faces. They were tired, battered from days on the run, but their resolve was unshaken. You've all done more than enough, she said. I won't ask you to come with me. One by one, they stepped forward, their expressions set with determination. We're with you, Sergeant, one of them said firmly. The others nodded in agreement. Lyra's chest tightened with pride, but she knew better than to let emotion cloud her judgment. She turned back to Rhaegar, who stood silently at her side. Are you ready for this? Rhaegar inclined his head. I've been ready my whole life. The journey to the ruins was grueling, the terrain growing harsher with each step. The wind howled through the rocky hills, carrying with it the scent of impending danger. Lyra kept her focus on the path ahead, her senses on high alert. Rhaegar moved beside her, his presence a constant source of both reassurance and tension. As night fell, they found shelter in a small canyon, the jagged cliffs offering some protection from the elements. The squad set up a makeshift camp, their movements quiet and efficient. Lyra sat by the fire, her thoughts heavy as she studied the flickering flames. Rhaegar approached, his large frame casting a shadow over her. He lowered himself to sit beside her, his eyes reflecting the firelight. For a while, neither of them spoke, the silence between them comfortable but charged. You're carrying a heavy burden, Rhaegar said finally, his voice low. Lyra glanced at him, a faint smile tugging at her lips. Comes with the territory, she said. Being in charge means making the hard calls. And yet, you still fight for those who might turn against you, he said, his tone thoughtful. You risk everything for people who may never understand what you've done. It's not about them, Lyra said quietly. It's about what's right. About stopping this war before it destroys everything. Rhaegar nodded, his gaze steady. You're braver than most, he said. Stronger than you realize. The sincerity in his voice made her chest tighten, and she felt a warmth spread through her. Without thinking, she reached out, her hand resting lightly on his arm. His fur was soft beneath her fingers, the strength of the muscle beneath undeniable. Rhaegar looked down at her hand, his eyes darkening slightly. Slowly, he raised his own hand, his claws brushing gently against her wrist. The touch sent a shiver through her, and for a moment, the world seemed to shrink to just the two of them. You've shown me a world I never thought possible, he said, his voice a low rumble. A world where trust and strength can exist together. Lyra's breath caught, her heart pounding. She met his gaze, and in that moment, she saw the vulnerability beneath his stoic exterior. He wasn't just a warrior or an ally, he was someone who had fought his own battles, carried his own scars. Rhaegar, she began, but the words caught in her throat. Before she could say more, he leaned in, his face inches from hers. His golden eyes searched hers, seeking permission, and when she didn't pull away, he closed the distance. Their lips met in a kiss that was both gentle and intense, a melding of strength and vulnerability. Lyra's hand slid up to his shoulder, her fingers tingling in his fur as she leaned into him. For a moment, the weight of the world lifted, and all that mattered was the connection between them. When they finally pulled apart, Lyra's cheeks were flushed, her heart racing. Rhaegar's eyes softened, a rare smile playing at his lips. "We should rest," he said softly. "Tomorrow will be a long day." Lyra nodded, her mind still reeling. As she settled into her sleeping role, her thoughts lingered on the man beside her and the battle that awaited them both. The ruins loomed ahead, their ancient stonework jutting out from the rugged hillside like jagged teeth. Vines and moss clung to the weathered surfaces, but even time hadn't diminished their imposing presence. Lyra and her team approached cautiously, the air thick with tension. The sun had barely begun to rise, casting long shadows that seemed to shift and stretch as if alive. Lyra held up a hand, signaling for the group to halt. She scanned the area, her rifle ready, every muscle in her body coiled with anticipation. Rhaegar moved up beside her, his keen senses attuned to the slightest disturbance. His golden eyes flicked over the ruins, a deep furrow in his brow. "They're here," he said, his voice a low rumble. "I can smell them." Lyra nodded, her jaw tightening. She had expected as much. The enemy wouldn't let such a vital location go undefended, especially not if they were as close to unlocking whatever ancient power these ruins held. "Spread out," she ordered quietly. "We need to find their entrance point and stop them before they get any further." Her squad moved swiftly, each soldier taking up a position around the perimeter. Lyra and Rhaegar stayed together, their movements synchronized as they crept closer to the main structure. The tension between them from the night before lingered, unspoken but ever present. It wasn't a distraction, though. If anything, it sharpened their focus, their trust in each other unshakable. They reached what appeared to be the primary entrance, a massive stone archway carved with intricate symbols. The faint flicker of torchlight danced on the walls beyond, and Lyra could hear the distant murmur of voices. She exchanged a glance with Rhaegar, who nodded grimly. "Stay close," she whispered, leading the way inside. The interior of the ruins was a labyrinth of winding corridors and crumbling chambers. The air was cool and damp, carrying the scent of earth and stone. Lyra's boots made barely a sound as she moved, her rifle trained on the path ahead. Rhaegar followed, his every step silent despite his size. They didn't have to go far before they encountered the enemy. A group of soldiers was gathered in a large chamber, their attention focused on a massive stone door adorned with glowing symbols. One of the soldiers, a tall man with an air of authority, was speaking in hushed tones, his hands gesturing toward the door as if explaining its secrets. Lyra's heart raced as she assessed the situation. They were outnumbered, but the element of surprise was on their side. She motioned for Rhaegar to flank left while she took up a position on the right. The two of them moved like shadows, slipping into cover behind the crumbling pillars that lined the chamber. Rhaegar's eyes met hers across the room, and she gave a single, decisive nod. Together they struck. Lyra's first shot rang out, the sharp crack of her rifle echoing through the chamber. One of the enemy soldiers dropped instantly, and chaos erupted. The others scrambled for their weapons, but Rhaegar was already upon them. He moved with terrifying speed, his claws slicing through armor as if it were paper. Lyra kept firing, her shots precise and deadly. She felt the familiar rush of adrenaline as the battle unfolded, her focus narrowing to the immediate task at hand. Beside her, Rhaegar was a force of nature, his strength and ferocity unmatched. The enemy soldiers quickly realized they were outmatched, their ranks thinning with every passing second. The leader of the group barked orders, trying to rally his men, but it was too late. Lyra's squad had entered the fray, their combined firepower overwhelming the remaining enemy forces. Within minutes, the chamber fell silent once more. The only sounds the heavy breathing of the victors and the distant hum of the stone door. Lyra approached the fallen leader, her rifle trained on him as he clutched his side, blood seeping through his fingers. He glared up at her, defiance burning in his eyes. "You won't stop it," he spat, his voice dripping with venom. "It's already begun." "What's already begun?" Lyra demanded, her voice cold and sharp. The man's lips curled into a bloodied smile. "You'll see." Before Lyra could press further, the symbols on the stone door began to glow more intensely, their light pulsing in a steady rhythm. The ground beneath them trembled, and a deep, resonant hum filled the air. "Lyra," Rhaegar said, his voice urgent. "We need to move." She glanced at him, her instinct screaming that he was right. Whatever was happening, they couldn't stay here. "Fall back," she ordered her squad. "Get to the surface now." The team moved quickly, retreating through the winding corridors as the ruins began to shake. The hum grew louder, the light from the door spilling into the hallway like a flood. Lyra stayed close to Rhaegar, her pulse hammering as they navigated the collapsing structure. They burst out into the open air just as a deep, earth-shattering roar erupted from within the ruins. Lyra turned to see a column of light shooting up into the sky, its glow illuminating the dark clouds above. The ground beneath them trembled violently, forcing them to brace against the rocks for support. "What the hell is that?" one of her soldiers shouted, his voice barely audible over the cacophony. Rhaegar's expression was grim. "The power they sought to unleash," he said. "But it's unstable. They've awakened something they can't control." Lyra's mind raced as she tried to process what was happening. The enemy had failed to harness the ruins' power, but the consequences could still be catastrophic. She turned to Rhaegar, her resolve hardening. "Then we stop it," she said. "Whatever it takes." Rhaegar nodded, his eyes fierce. Together. As the light from the ruins continued to blaze, Lyra knew that their fight was far from over. The stakes had never been higher, but with Rhaegar by her side, she felt a renewed sense of determination. They had come too far to turn back now. The real battle was just beginning. The light from the ruins cast an eerie glow over the surrounding landscape, the pulsating beam stretching skyward like a beacon. Lyra's squad had retreated to a safe distance, regrouping in a rocky outcrop where they could assess the situation. The tremors had subsided for now, but the tension in the air was palpable, an unspoken acknowledgement that this was merely the calm before the storm. Rhaegar stood at the edge of the group, his gaze fixed on the ruins. His jaw was set, his muscles taut with anticipation. Lyra approached him, her rifle slung across her back. The faint glow of the light reflected in his golden eyes, making them appear almost molten. "We can't let this power fall into the wrong hands," Lyra said, her voice steady despite the weight of her words. "If it's unstable, as you said, we need to shut it down before it destroys everything." Rhaegar nodded, his gaze never leaving the ruins. "The energy they've awakened isn't just destructive, it's alive. It will seek out a host, someone strong enough to wield it. If they manage to harness even a fraction of it." He didn't finish the sentence, but the gravity of his meaning was clear. Lyra placed a hand on his arm, her touch grounding him. "Then we go back in," she said. "Together." Rhaegar turned to her, his expression softening slightly. "You've faced death more times than I can count, yet you never hesitate." She offered a small smile. "That's what happens when you've got something worth fighting for." His hand covered hers, his clawed fingers surprisingly gentle. "And you do," he said quietly. The moment between them was brief but powerful, a silent vow that whatever lay ahead, they would face it as one. Lyra pulled her hand away and turned to her squad. "Here's the plan," she said, addressing the group. "We're going back into the ruins. Our priority is to find the source of that energy and neutralize it. We'll need to move quickly and stay sharp. Any hesitation could cost us." The soldiers nodded, their faces a mixture of fear and determination. They had followed her this far, and she knew they would see this mission through, no matter the odds. Rhaegar stepped forward. "I'll take point," he said. "My senses will help us navigate faster, and if there's any danger, I'll deal with it." Lyra didn't argue. She knew his strength and instincts would be invaluable. "Let's move." The group made their way back toward the ruins, the beam of light serving as both a guide and a warning. As they re entered the ancient structure, the temperature dropped noticeably, the air thick with an almost tangible energy. The corridors seemed darker than before, the walls pulsing faintly with the same rhythmic glow as the beam outside. Rhaegar led the way, his movements fluid and precise. He paused frequently, his ears twitching as he listened for any sign of danger. Lyra stayed close, her rifle at the ready, her eyes scanning the shadows for movement. They reached the central chamber without incident, but the sight that greeted them was far more ominous than before. The stone door they had seen earlier was now wide open, revealing a massive cavern beyond. The beam of light emanated from a crystalline structure at the center, its surface etched with glowing runes. At the base of the structure stood a lone figure, cloaked in the same dark armor as the enemy soldiers. He was chanting in a low, guttural language, his hands raised toward the crystal as if drawing power from it. The air around him shimmered with heat, distorting his form like a mirage. Lyra raised her rifle, but Rhaegar placed a hand on her arm, stopping her. "Wait," he said. "That's not just a soldier. He's the conduit." "What does that mean?" Lyra whispered. "It means he's already begun to merge with the energy," Rhaegar explained. "If we kill him now, the energy will lash out uncontrollably. We need to disrupt the connection first." Lyra's mind raced as she considered their options. "How do we do that?" Rhaegar's gaze flicked to the glowing runes on the crystal. "Those symbols are the key. If we can disrupt the flow of energy, it will weaken the conduit's hold." Lyra nodded, formulating a plan. "I'll cover you. Focus on the runes." Rhaegar didn't hesitate. He moved swiftly toward the crystal, his massive form blending into the shadows. Lyra signaled for her squad to take up defensive positions, their weapons trained on the conduit. As Rhaegar reached the crystal, the conduit turned, his eyes glowing with an unnatural light. He let out a guttural roar, and the air around him erupted in a shockwave of energy. Lyra braced herself, firing a burst of shots to distract him. Rhaegar didn't falter. His claws slashed across the runes, disrupting their glow. The crystal pulsed violently, the beam of light flickering as the energy flow destabilized. The conduit staggered, his connection to the crystal weakening. He let out another roar, this one laced with pain and fury. Energy coiled around him like serpents, lashing out at anything within reach. "Keep him off me," Rhaegar shouted, his voice strained as he continued to disrupt the runes. Lyra and her squad opened fire, their bullets finding their mark despite the chaotic environment. The conduit faltered, his movements becoming erratic as the energy around him grew unstable. Finally, with one last slash, Rhaegar severed the final rune. The crystal let out a deafening hum, and the beam of light shattered into a million fragments, each piece dissolving into the air like sparks. The conduit collapsed to his knees, the glow in his eyes fading. Without the crystal's power, he was just a man, broken and defeated. Rhaegar turned to Lyra, his chest heaving. "It's done." Lyra nodded, her heart pounding with a mix of relief and exhaustion. "Let's get out of here." They retreated from the chamber as the ruins began to collapse, the unstable energy wreaking havoc on the ancient structure. By the time they reached the surface, the beam of light was gone, replaced by the quiet stillness of dawn. Lyra turned to her squad, her voice steady despite the exhaustion in her bones. "We did it." Rhaegar stood beside her, his presence a comforting weight. They had faced the worst together, and they had won. But even as they stood in the light of their victory, Lyra knew their journey was far from over. The war still raged, and their fight was only just beginning. The dawn sky was streaked with fiery hues as Lyra and her squad stood on the ridge, the ruins now a smoldering silhouette behind them. The crystalline energy had dissipated, leaving the air strangely still, as if the world itself held its breath. They had accomplished what seemed impossible, yet the weight of their victory sat heavily on Lyra's shoulders. She knew the fight was far from over. Her squad was silent, their faces etched with exhaustion. Rhaegar stood slightly apart, his towering form still and watchful. His golden eyes scanned the horizon, his sharp features betraying no hint of the turmoil that surely brewed beneath the surface. Lyra approached him, her step slow and deliberate. "We stopped them, but it's not enough," she said, her voice low. "They'll regroup. They always do." Rhaegar's gaze shifted to her, his expression unreadable. "Then we'll be ready." There was a conviction in his tone that sent a spark of determination through her. They had faced insurmountable odds before and emerged stronger. Together, they were a force to be reckoned with. Lyra nodded, her resolve hardening. "We need to get back to the outpost. If the enemy is planning another move, we need to know about it." Rhaegar inclined his head in agreement. "Lead the way." The journey back was grueling. The terrain was unforgiving, and every step seemed to sap more of their dwindling energy. But Lyra pushed forward, her focus unyielding. She could feel Rhaegar's steady presence beside her, his strength a silent reassurance. Despite everything, they had forged a bond that could not be broken. As they neared the outpost, the familiar sight of its fortified walls brought a flicker of relief. The guards at the gate recognized them immediately, their expressions shifting from suspicion to surprise and then to grim understanding. Word of their mission had likely spread, and their return would bring with it a new set of challenges. Captain Renard met them in the central hall, his sharp eyes taking in the weary group. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Report," he demanded. Lyra stepped forward, her voice steady despite her exhaustion. She recounted the events at the ruins, detailing the enemy's attempts to harness the ancient energy and the desperate battle to stop them. She spared no detail, her words painting a vivid picture of the stakes they faced. Renard listened in silence, his expression growing darker with each passing moment. When Lyra finished, he let out a heavy sigh. "You've done more than anyone could have asked, Sergeant," he said. "But this war is far from over. If what you're saying is true, the enemy won't stop until they find another way to turn the tide." Lyra nodded. "We need to strengthen our defenses and prepare for their next move. And we need to figure out what they're after. This isn't just about territory anymore." Renard's gaze flicked to Rhaegar, who stood silently beside Lyra. "And what about him? Do you trust him?" Without hesitation, Lyra replied, "With my life." Renard studied her for a long moment before nodding. "Very well, but understand this. The alliance between our people is tenuous at best. There will be those who see him as a threat, no matter what he's done." Lyra's jaw tightened. "Then we'll prove them wrong." Renard didn't argue. Instead, he turned to his officers, barking orders to reinforce the outpost and prepare for the inevitable retaliation. The room buzzed with activity as soldiers moved to carry out his commands. Once the initial rush subsided, Lyra found herself alone with Rhaegar in the quiet of the central hall. The weight of the past few days pressed down on her, and for the first time, she allowed herself a moment to breathe. "You've risked everything for this," Rhaegar said, his voice low and steady. "For me." Lyra looked up at him, her gaze unwavering. "I did what needed to be done, and I'd do it again." Rhaegar's eyes softened, a flicker of something unspoken passing between them. "You're unlike anyone I've ever known," Lyra Draven. The way he said her name sent a warmth through her, and she felt a faint blush rise to her cheeks. She stepped closer, her hand reaching out to rest lightly on his arm. "And you're not what I expected either." They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of their shared experiences settling between them. Lyra could feel the tension, the unspoken connection that had grown stronger with each passing day. She met his gaze, her heart pounding in her chest. Without thinking, she leaned in, her lips brushing against his in a kiss that was both tender and charged with emotion. Rhaegar responded immediately, his hands coming up to cradle her face with surprising gentleness. The world around them seemed to fade away, leaving only the warmth of their connection. When they finally pulled apart, Lyra felt a sense of clarity she hadn't known she needed. Rhaegar's eyes searched hers, his expression a mix of vulnerability and determination. No matter what comes next, he said quietly, we face it together. Lyra nodded, her resolve stronger than ever. Together. The moment was interrupted by the sound of hurried footsteps. One of Renard's officers appeared, his face pale and his expression grim. Sergeant Draven, Captain Renard needs you in the war room immediately. Lyra's stomach tightened. What is it? The officer hesitated. We've received intelligence. The enemy is mobilizing a large force. They're planning an assault. Lyra exchanged a glance with Rhaegar, her mind already racing. There was no time to waste. She squared her shoulders, her focus sharpening. Let's go, she said. As they followed the officer to the war room, Lyra felt a familiar surge of determination. The battle ahead would test them in ways they couldn't yet predict, but she knew one thing for certain. With Rhaegar by her side, she was ready to face whatever came next. The war room was a hive of activity when Lyra and Rhaegar entered, the dim light from the central map table casting long shadows across the stone walls. The table itself was covered in maps and reports, the positions of enemy forces marked with red tokens that seemed to multiply with each passing moment. Captain Renard stood at the head of the room, his face set in a grim mask as he conferred with his officers. Lyra stepped forward, her presence immediately drawing the attention of the gathered leaders. She felt the weight of their gazes, the unspoken questions hanging heavy in the air. Rhaegar followed closely, his imposing figure a stark contrast to the humans around him. The room fell silent as all eyes turned toward the pair. Renard wasted no time. Our scouts report a large enemy force mobilizing from the east, he said, his voice steady despite the gravity of the situation. They're moving fast and seem to be targeting this outpost directly. If their estimates are correct, we're looking at an all-out assault within the next 48 hours. Lyra studied the map, her sharp eyes tracing the marked positions of enemy units. They're not wasting any time, she said, her tone measured. They know we've weakened their hold on the ruins, and now they're coming to finish the job. Renard nodded. Exactly. This will be their attempt to crush our defenses and reclaim the ground they've lost. Lyra's mind raced as she considered their options. They couldn't afford to lose the outpost. It was a critical stronghold and their best line of defense against the enemy's advance. But the odds were daunting, and the enemy's numbers far exceeded their own. We'll need to fortify our defenses and set up ambush points along their approach, she said, her voice firm. If we can weaken their forces before they reach the walls, we'll stand a better chance of holding them off. Renard gestured to the map. We've identified several choke points along their likely route. If we position our forces strategically, we can force them into a bottleneck and take out as many as possible before they reach the main gates. Lyra nodded, her gaze shifting to Rhaegar. Your senses and strength will be crucial. We'll need you on the front lines. Rhaegar inclined his head. I'll do whatever it takes. Renard hesitated for a moment before speaking again. There's more, he said, his tone heavy. Our scouts also reported something unusual among the enemy ranks. They spotted a figure, cloaked and heavily guarded, leading the charge. Whoever it is, they're not like the others. Lyra's brow furrowed. Another conduit? Possibly, Renard said. But we can't be sure. What we do know is that they're a priority target. If they're controlling the enemy's movements, taking them out could turn the tide in our favor. Lyra exchanged a glance with Rhaegar, her determination mirrored in his eyes. They had faced powerful enemies before, and while the thought of another conduit was daunting, it wasn't enough to shake her resolve. We'll handle it, she said, but we'll need every advantage we can get. Renard nodded. You'll have it. We'll begin preparations immediately. The meeting broke, and the room buzzed with activity as the officers set to work coordinating their defenses. Lyra and Rhaegar stepped aside, their conversation private amid the organized chaos. Another conduit, Lyra said quietly. If they've already started merging with the energy, this could be worse than we thought. Rhaegar's expression darkened. We've seen what that kind of power can do, but we also know how to stop it. Lyra placed a hand on his arm, her touch grounding him. "We'll get through this," she said, her voice filled with quiet determination. "We've come too far to let them win now." Rhaegar's gaze softened, and he covered her hand with his own. "Together," he said, the word carrying a weight of its own. The next 2 days were a blur of activity as the outpost prepared for the impending assault. Trenches were dug, barricades reinforced, and weapons distributed. Lyra worked tirelessly alongside her squad, her leadership and unshakable focus inspiring those around her. Rhaegar was a constant presence, his strength and instincts invaluable as they prepared for the battle ahead. As night fell on the eve of the assault, the outpost was quiet, the calm before the storm. Lyra stood on the wall, her eyes fixed on the dark horizon. The enemy was out there, waiting, and she knew it was only a matter of time before they struck. Rhaegar joined her, his large frame a comforting silhouette against the night sky. "You should rest," he said, his voice low. Lyra shook her head. "Can't afford to. Not now." He was silent for a moment before placing a hand on her shoulder. "You've done everything you can," he said. "The soldiers trust you. I trust you." Lyra turned to him, her gaze softening. "I couldn't have done this without you." Rhaegar's eyes met hers, and for a moment, the weight of the world seemed to fade. He leaned in, his forehead touching hers, a gesture of quiet intimacy that spoke volumes. "We'll face this together," he said. Lyra nodded, drawing strength from his presence. Together. The enemy arrived at dawn, their approach heralded by the distant sound of marching boots and the low rumble of siege engines. The outpost came alive with activity, soldiers manning their positions as the final preparations were made. Lyra stood at the front, her rifle ready and her heart steady. She could see the enemy now, a sea of dark figures moving across the landscape, their numbers seemingly endless. At their head was the cloaked figure Renard had described, their presence radiating an unsettling energy. The battle began with a thunderous roar as the enemy charged. The ground shook beneath their feet, and the air was filled with the cacophony of gunfire and clashing steel. Lyra led her squad with precision, her commands cutting through the chaos as they held the line. Rhaegar was a force of nature, his claws and strength turning the tide wherever he fought. Together, they pushed back wave after wave, their bond an unbreakable shield against the enemy's relentless assault. As the battle raged on, Lyra's focus narrowed on the cloaked figure. She knew this was the key to their victory. With Rhaegar by her side, she prepared to face the final challenge, determined to protect the future they had fought so hard to build.